Thank you for that introduction. I apologize for speaking in English, but I am going to speak in English anyway, and try not to do so very rapidly. I'm also going to walk around. It helps me think. And what I'm going to talk about tonight will be a relatively casual survey of Kaprow's work from about 1957 up through the late 1960s towards the kind of work that is presented out there. And I want to frame what I'm going to say in a couple of different ways. Yeah? Okay. Are you getting translation? Okay? Yeah? So I'm going to frame it in a couple of different ways. The first thing I'd like to raise as a sort of event on the horizon established by Kaprow's work is something we can talk about a little bit later after I've finished showing you what I'm going to show you. And that is the current practice among museums, as well as the sort of set of dilemmas raised by that practice of redoing or restaging classic works of performance. So I'm showing you as a marker for that restaging an image of Marina Abramovich re-performing classic work by Marina Abramovich by Joseph Beuys, How to Teach Pictures to a Dead Hare. So this is Abramovich re-performing the Beuys piece in 2007 as part of a series of re-performances she did at the Guggenheim Museum in New York. For that re-performance, she went and interviewed Beuys's family, members of his family, people who had been in his milieu at the time of the work, trying to reconstruct performed work which famously had no observers. So Beuys had himself shut in a space overnight with this body of a dead hare and was speaking to this hare. So re-performance is an interesting issue, and it raises a number of problems. One is, can we re-experience something of the authentic to the original work? Is there some way we can be faithful to the original work? And part of Abramovich's premise is that classic works of performance art need to be archived, and that they can be archived in a kind of physical memory, and then retaught to a new generation. So this is, for her, an act of homage to Beuys, but also an act of pedagogy, an act of instruction. It's problematic in certain ways, but it's a very, very interesting experiment, I think. That type of authenticity, I'll just say as a footnote, this is not a hare, so there's some inauthentic things. It's an American jackrabbit, so it's the wrong kind of animal. It's not caught out in the wild. It was a lab animal that was delivered by Federal Express in a frozen packet. And in order for it to actually achieve a kind of animal-like liveliness, the preparators, this is good for the archive, the preparators had to break its spine in several places so that it would actually fly. So there's some interesting tricks to making the re-performance look like, resemble the photograph that is the locus classicus for understanding or thinking about the Beuys work. I also like this image because it indicates almost accidentally something about an adherence to an ideal form, right? A kind of Platonic form of this performance. Versus this piece, which was the invitational postcard for a show that Allan Kaprow had at the John Gibson Gallery in New York in 1995. And I know you can't read this probably, but it says, "This is a tidy situation." This is a tidy, it's limpia. It's a tidy situation. It's a classic introduction to a kind of Kaprow play in a number of different respects. First of all, tidy. His shirt is untucked, right? The pocket flap is flipped up. He's not tidy at all. Right? There's things that are just slightly not quite right. Everything is a little bit off-kilter. The subject of the photograph, the nominal subject, is off-center. Right? Somebody is distracting us, looking out the other way. So it's far from a tidy situation. The second thing that this photograph, well, this work, rather, photo text is doing is making use of the indexical, right, the index finger, by pointing at the viewer visually, and then reusing a type of indexical language to suture, to enfold the viewer into a kind of circuit, right, with the work itself. And then the third thing, it's my cheap joke, if Abramovich is sort of thinking about a Platonic ideal, Kaprow is continually thinking about interpersonal circuits, right? Circuits between people. And this is my third cheap framing device, also about pointing. This is an illustration from an article in the New York Times that appeared in 2004. It comes from the research being done by a neuroscientist. It's a continuing research project in what we might call cognitive mapping. This scientist is testing to see whether brain activity is altered by tool use. Okay? They haven't illustrated the little electrode sticking out of the monkey's head, but he's taken this monkey and using electrodes mapped its brain activity in a given space, and the way in which that brain activity reflects the understanding the monkey has of what it can physically reach, what it can touch. Right? And what the scientist has established via neuroscience, it's intuitive generally, but this is what neuroscientists do. Given this, the monkey's reach allows it to make a map in its brain of a certain territory. Given a tool, the monkey understands that its territory expands with that tool. And then when the tool is taken away, the map in the monkey's brain still enfolds the space that that tool can reach. In other words, it learns about space. It learns about the world around it through the apprehension, the knowledge of this tool. So I like to think about art this way, that art is like this tool for us. And I like to do that, at least for me, it helps me think about art in a way that is somewhat distinct from language or linguistic descriptions. Why we keep going back to works, because they help us think, not because they speak to us directly. Okay. What I'm going to talk about tonight, I've called loosely Kaprow's syntax. What I want to walk you through is the way in which this artist moved from one place of experiment with embodiment, with time, with space, towards another place that is much more open, as with the examples that are out in the hall. And the way in which I want to do that is through thinking about Kaprow's, what we might call formalism, because he was, in essence, a formalist. He thought in a very clear way and made very straightforward, almost linear types of experiments as he tried out different types of practice, eliminated certain things, began to understand other things as problematic, and moved towards the direction that his work took. So what I'm showing you here are two different moments from his career. This is one page from a set of pages. There are hundreds of pages of notes that Kaprow made in preparation for his first major public happening, 18 happenings in 6 parts. So this set of notes, this page, is a description of some of the physical movements that take place at one moment in 18 happenings in 6 parts. And these are very simple physical diagrams, as you can see, stick figures. They're sort of proto-choreographic. I've been told by dancers that, in fact, as simple as the drawings are, these are very difficult moves to sustain. Right? The timing is difficult, and in certain cases, the positioning is very difficult. So there's an interesting exploration of physical movement and its formalizing that takes place here. This note also shows you that, that in the very beginning of Kaprow's exploration of events, the durational, he exerted a very tight control, or tried to exert a very tight control over the way in which participants occupied space and time. The second image is one spread, 2 pages, from a booklet called Likely Stories from 1974. And this spread takes on the classic format of Kaprow's work of the 70s and after, that is a photo text format with a very simple pared down text, almost, I won't say haiku-like, but written in the present tense, quasi-instructional, so that he's giving you directions for how to do a thing, and then photographs that are not documentation of a performance of this thing, he would claim, but rather indications of how you might go about performing this thing, this set of instructions. In other words, there's an open space between the language and the image, and there's a kind of open space inside the language and inside the images as well. These are indicators rather than fixed models, unlike those. So we're going to look at how he got from there to there. I'm going to take you through some early works, and I apologize for the darkness of this projections, actually sort of bright image. This is a late painting from 1957 called Baby. Allan Kaprow here. The picture is from much later. I think it's from the 1980s. But what this object shows you, it's its construction, is the moment in which Kaprow, who began his career as an expressionist painter, and then moved into what he called expressive collage. begins to move the painted surface out into real space in a number of different ways. One is through the use of these flaps of canvas, which actually stick out from the surface a number of inches, centimeters. So these are loose flaps. Two is through the use of reflective material. This is aluminum foil up here on two different sections. There are other places over here, down here, and over here that have this reflective material that has a way of de-dimensionalizing, that is, assaulting the dimension of the painting itself, and at least referring to a kind of absorption of the viewer into the work. So it's an interesting attempt to wrestle with real dimension, right? Not virtual dimension. And then the third type of assault on dimensionality is the insertion of bits of language, fragments of language, which is also typical of Kaprow's work. And in this case, the name, part of the name of his wife, Vaughn, here, in a variety of different places, to call out both in a personal way, but also in a lexical fashion. That is, we read these elements in a different way than we see painted surfaces. They have different relationships to dimension. Kaprow talked about himself as an expressionist painter, but he also thought very long and hard about the tools of that painting. He wasn't a very good painter, for what it's worth, but he thought very hard about the tools of that that painting and its modalities, and worked his way through a sequence of experiments in that project as he moved forward. In 1956, the American painter Jackson Pollock ran his car into a tree and died. And Pollock had been the great expressionist example for young American painters in the 1950s, and seemed to have reached a kind of acme, a high point of expressive painterly practice. And Kaprow, who had written about him as a master's student, wrote an homage that is also a kind of manifesto, and turns out to have been a manifesto for the type of work that would take place in the 1960s. And that essay is called The Legacy of Jackson Pollock. In that essay, so I'm showing you the first page of it as it appeared in Art News. It was suppressed for 2 years. He wrote it in 1956. It was published later. And in that essay, he famously performs an analysis of Pollock's work. And he says, well, Pollock's work, in terms of space, scale, form, and process, has really pushed painting perhaps as far as it can go in terms of a type of avant-garde logic. Yeah? So he says, well, for the rest of us, where are we left? He says, Pollock left us at the point where we must become preoccupied with and even dazzled by the space and objects of our everyday life, either our bodies, clothes, rooms, or, if need be, the vastness of 42nd Street. So he's saying a kind of physiological engagement with embodiment and an engagement with urban space. Not satisfied with the suggestion through paint of our other senses, we shall utilize the specific substances of sight, sound, movements, people, odors, touch. Objects of every sort are materials for the new art: paint, chairs, food, electric and neon lights, smoke, water, old socks, a dog, movies, 1,000 other things that will be discovered by the present generation of artists. Okay? So it's a kind of romantic list, and he writes in a kind of romantic style, but it's also a list that says all of this material is available to us for making art. And it's a call, in a sense, for a new kind of Gesamtkunstwerk, but we'll bracket that term. A new kind of artwork. So he sees that Pollock has produced a closure in the language of painting, and then forced an opening into a language of materiality. Incidentally, one of the ways in which that happens, that happens through Pollock's extension of the scale of painting into a kind of architectural scale, the occupation of real space by the Pollock paintings, the way in which an encounter with one of those large works is an encounter with a kind of proprioceptive absorption, but also that there's stuff. Because Pollock worked on the horizontal, there's stuff embedded in these paintings. Cigarettes, coins, keys, junk. And that the materiality of that junk is also important. Okay. To give you a sense of one of the ways in which Kaprow himself put that set of observations to work, this is a spread from a book that Kaprow was working on from about 1959, 1964, where it was published in 1966, called Assemblage Environments Happenings. This is a two-page spread in which you can see one of the famous images, photographs of Jackson Pollock in his studio, working in this environment shaped by his own paintings. In such a way, the photograph suggests that there was incredible movement. Actually, he worked very slowly, but and that he's dissolving into the space of his work. Pollock famously said, you know, when I'm in my painting, I don't know who, you know, I don't exist anymore, I'm part of it. And Kaprow juxtaposes that with his own work from 1961 called Yard, an environment, that was in the back of a gallery on the Upper East Side of Manhattan. It's the back space of the gallery, exterior space. These are sculptures that have been covered over with tar paper and tied up. Incidentally, a toxic material, and that's, I think, surprisingly important. It's one of Kaprow's favorite materials, very toxic. And so he covered those up and then filled the thing with used car tires. What he's doing with this juxtaposition is, at the very first level, playing with the graphic quality of black and white. Right? The graphic quality, and indicating something about the horizontal procedure that Pollock used and the gravitational procedure that produced this piece, Yard, and these tires lying on the ground. So there's a homology there in procedure, and there's a homology in terms of the graphic effect, right, at this point. There's more recently, people have been thinking about, and late in his career, Kaprow talked about how difficult it was when this show was over to get rid of the tires. They're very toxic, right? There's toxic waste. And in part through this, this work, he became engaged in thinking about toxic materials, waste, obsolescence, car culture, and not coincidentally, labor, work. So the photograph appears casual. It is casual, but it's, I think, not coincidental that he's always wearing blue jeans. He's a professor at this point. I think he's still at Rutgers. He's a professor at Rutgers University, but he's wearing blue jeans and a work shirt, right? And it's important to him that art is work, right? Has something to do with work. So there's a language being spoken in this photograph that's very deliberate. So I want to say something a little bit about Kaprow's deliberateness. Another spread from his book. We can talk about the book later, I guess. Panels to rearrange. This is young Allan Kaprow, not in jeans, right, in his professional artist outfit, or a corduroy, intellectual. In front of a piece called Rearrangeable Panels. This is from the late 1950s. This piece has two names. One is Rearrangeable Panels, and the other is Kiosk. As rearrangeable panels, it usually appears this way, flat, and each of these is a distinct panel, separate panel. Right? So you can move, this is the little skinny one, this is the big one. You can move them around in any order that you would like, nominally. And then the second arrangement forms an architectural enclosure, like a newspaper kiosk. That is, it takes those panels and uses them as a kind of palisade, right? As a kind of structure. The panels work with what he thought of as his kind of action collage technique, but they're kind of interesting in a couple of different ways. The first is this rearrangement possibility. The second is, in fact, the language that they speak. So there are opaque panels, reflective panels, solid panels, fractured panels, panels with square elements, panels with round elements, flat panels, panels with protrusions, abstract panels, and then these are plastic apples glued onto the panels. In other words, each of these elements speaks to the other elements, right? It's distinct in some way, but all told, they form a kind of system, signifying system. And here again is this typical use of mirrors. Very difficult to photograph, and deliberately so, right? To this, already at this early point in his thinking, a kind of engagement with the photography of artworks and ways of problematizing that. It's also worth noting that some of these, although this piece now exists in a private collection, some of these panels were used in 18 Happenings in 6 parts as backdrops. So they have a very kind of life. So what I want you to be able to see is that this particular work is structured almost like a sentence. Okay. I think this is apart from Abramovich, this is the one other performed work that I'm throwing in here. This is an image from a happening by Klaus Oldenburg of 1960 called Snapshots from the City. And again, it's a kind of deceptive image. The Snapshots from the City was made up of a series of vignettes in a very narrow architectural space that were lit stroboscopically by someone flashing the light on and off. So in fact, you would never get a view like this at all. There's Oldenburg hiding in garbage over here. And Oldenburg was interested in these kind of flash frames of experience, right? Where you see something sort of traumatic, distressing, has to do with these changing urban structure in Lower Manhattan, as well as with the found materials that were available in that changing urban structure. Kaprow, in his essay, prognosticates, again, and he says this interesting thing that I think is worth bearing in mind when we think about those early performed projects that were happenings. He says, not only will these bold creators show us, as if for the first time, the world we have always had about us, but ignored, but they will disclose entirely unheard of happenings and events, found in garbage cans, police files, hotel lobbies, seen in store windows and on the streets, and sensed in dreams and horrible accidents. So this is the locus classicus for the word happenings, and this gives the name to the performance form that comes after it. So that's one important thing about this little remark. And again, you see that technique of establishing a list, a sort of litany of objects or phrases. The second thing I think is interesting is that in fact this is a rather dark imagining of what the contents of these works will be. Right? Hotel lobbies, dreams, horrible accidents, police files, and so on. So he's not solely working up a kind of joyful type of project. There's a criticality too, an observation that takes everything in this new urban environment. Okay?
Please, but if you can hear me, not for us, it's for Sylvia.
For Sylvia,
yeah,
okay. Okay. So Pollock forms one clear backdrop for this kind of work. The second teacher, if you will, is the American composer John Cage. And I'm showing you here one of the versions of his score for his 1952 piece, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, his silent work. This exists in 3 different scores. There's a score on musical signature, there's a score that's a drawing, and then there's this score which says 3 movements, tacet, tacet, tacet. And Cage writes here, the title of this work is the total length in minutes and seconds of its performance, and then he tells the story of its first performance. And probably most of you know this from the Cage show that was here just recently. This piece, famously, is silent. And that silence does a couple of things. One, and this was Kaprow's understanding, its performance made available all sounds as music, at least conceptually. In other words, you mark out a duration, and everything that takes place that is sonic, including no sound, within that duration is part of the piece. The second thing that happens is equally important, but it's sort of swept under the rug usually, which is that in order to signal the piece and its parts, there have to be visual cues. In other words, the music, that is sound, is visually cued. It's a theatrical performance. So Kaprow had extended his paintings into this physical collage space and was interested in engaging with other kinds of other dimensions, let's say, in his practice. And he had also experimented with smell. He had started to work on an environmental scale. He had some very unfortunate experiments with smell. Yeah, he didn't realize that, you know, when you make perfume, you just need a tiny, tiny bit of whatever it is. And somebody gave him some civet, you know, which is from cat glands. And he used a lot of it in a room, and they had to evacuate this the entire building for this show. So he was interested anyway, but he was interested in expanding his practice with these new kinds of materials, whether they're sensory, what have you. And one of the materials was sound. He'd also experimented with tape loops and cut up sound. And so he went and John Cage was teaching a class at the New School in New York, an experimental composition class. And Kaprow, along with many other visual artists, and most of the students in that class were visual artists rather than composers, went to this experimental composition class, understanding that what Cage was doing in terms of opening out scoring of whatever the artwork was, whether it was music, language piece, or a painting that relied upon chance, that Cage was opening out possibilities through his deployment of a variety of chance and indeterminate techniques. So I'm showing you just as sort of devices for indicating what was going on in that kind of project. A score for a piece called Water Music. I know it's hard to see, but this is written language, little bits of language, linguistic instruction. A score for something called Fontana Mix, and then handwritten notes for how to use that score. This is on several sheets of Mylar that can be moved around. And what Cage is doing here is not saying, oh, I've made some marks and you can do whatever you want. In fact, to play these, he required virtuoso players of whatever instrument. Players who would be able to produce an interpretation of a given set of notes and then follow through on their interpretation, their expertise. So Kaprow goes and takes a class with Cage and works with composition. I'm showing you here one of his pieces of homework for that class. Also hard to read, so I'll tell you what it says. Because it's an indicator of what's to come. So what he's done is he's marked out 7 different elements and given durations, time, and then kinds of things that happen to those elements. So at the top, there's a piece of screen, and you scratch on the screen for half a minute. Number 2 is a blue bottle. You blow on that blue bottle for a certain amount of time. Then number 3 is you strike that bottle. Someone strikes it. A green bottle, you strike it at a certain moment, and so on, all the way down to this is a drawing of what you're supposed to do with a knife. You stick the knife in the board, so that's one sound, and then the second sound, the second set of instructions is to flip the knife so it goes, and he's actually drawn little cartoon indicators to tell you how to do that. So this is 1958, and clearly what Kaprow is doing is building up the kind of notational language that he's going to put into play when he devises this piece, 18 happenings in 6 parts. I'm setting this Cagean score next to the reading of Jackson Pollock, so that you can, mentally hold in tension these 2 kinds of elements. One, a scripted out, very tight temporal scale and set of instructions, and 2, this chaotic, chance-driven, gravity-dependent type of grand drawing. And then finally, what came out of that process for this artist and for other artists working alongside him was an engagement with both composition and chance. An engagement, too, with the language of painting as a language that now moved beyond painting, that he took somewhere else. 3, with an embracing of what I've called junk aesthetic, throwaway culture, obsolescence, materiality, right? A very eclectic kind of materiality. And then 4, in a kind of suppressed way, but nevertheless present, a politics that has to do with attention to the everyday in both its upbeat and its negative aspects, its policing and its freedoms, and an attention to the culture of obsolescence, the commodity, right? Commodity culture. So I'm going to, for the sake of time, move quickly through looking at 18 happenings in 6 parts. It's a breakthrough work. This is the program. It lists the different parts held by different actors in this piece, and then gives the instructions for the audience. The program is out. I can't remember which. I think it's on the very first table when you come in. So you can have a look at that program for yourselves. What the program shows you is that this 18 happenings in 6 parts is a work that is highly orchestrated. It involved rehearsals. Here's a nice view of the set. This is Kaprow himself sitting inside one of the parts. The space itself was split out into 3 different sections. There was no place in the gallery from which anyone could see the whole production, and that was very deliberate. And then at select intervals, the audience was directed to get up from one space and move to another space. Everybody got different instructions. So there was a constant fragmenting of attention to these events that were taking place in front of the audience, as well as movement throughout the space. It's also interesting, this thing there's a record player, vinyl, LP player, playing records in here of marching tunes and so on. I think this is a weird, bad American interpretation of Russian constructivist theater design. But that's just a side note. It's supposed to be a human figure. Yeah, I think he was looking at Popova, but not very nicely. So here's some other views of the set. This is a highly orchestrated piece. It was also rehearsed, right? There were a number of rehearsals. Professional actors came over thinking there was going to be this avant-garde theatrical piece, and he said, "Oh, they're acting, go away. I just want people to do the things that I instruct them to do." Kaprow again, Lucas Samaras, an actor from, I think, La Mama, and I forget this person's name. What you see on the upper right are tape decks that had pre-recorded sound that also went off at given intervals as a kind of cue to get people to move around, sometimes as part of the performance itself. And you can see also up here at the very top light bulb, the top of the frames of this space were covered with light bulbs, like a penny arcade, that would flash, right, at the moment that people were meant to get up and move around. And then finally, let's see how ugly that is. Yeah, you can see barely. This is one page again of these notes in developing this kind of piece. That what he's interested in is, in fact, the fragmenting of the view, right? The fragmenting of one's space, one's proprioceptive physical space. And then there's a sequence of gestures listed here. So he's interested in how bodies move. Now, in researching this piece, the dance historian André Lepecki, who staged a beautiful redo of the work, discovered something very peculiar, which is there's a very rigid time score for 18 happenings in 6 parts. And this peculiarity is spoken to by Delaney in that book. And that is that during the breaks between parts, there's in fact more time for those breaks than the parts themselves take up. In other words, you sit, you watch some stuff, other things are happening here that are distracting. Some kind of thing goes off. It's over, you're supposed to move to the next place. And there's more time spent in that non-scripted social sphere, right, in which you're negotiating around other members of the nominal audience than there is devoted to the events themselves. And Lepecki's conclusion, and I think he's right, is that too, that non-scripted social interaction was part of the material that Kaprow was working with. This piece is both a beginning and an end for this artist. He realizes the rigidity of the script and the score, the rehearsals, is too consuming as a project, but also is not actually what he's interested in exploring. Rather, and this would tend to confirm Lepecki's conclusion, what he's interested in exploring is that kind of non-scripted, open social engagement. And he begins to construct a series of quasi-environments that come with very simple directions for use by way of exploring how people go about engaging with one another and with materials. Right? This is an image from a piece that you have done, Push and Pull, a furniture comedy for Hans Hofmann of 1962. This first iteration existed, as is typical for a lot of Kaprow's work, in 2 different rooms. There are piles of furniture, and the audience, as it were, in fact, participants could move that furniture around until they found an arrangement with which they were comfortable. So it's about again, a kind of very basic labor, primary labor, a simple activity, in this case a domestic activity, and a movement from one space to another, a kind of binary, working with a binary. So you could work in such a way that you balanced that binary, the 2 rooms, or that you weighted one and emptied another. You could work in a variety of different ways. That's one kind of simple structuring option that he liked to use. This is reproduced in his book, and it's actually 2 photos. It's a very annoying image, but it's 2 photographs of a work called Words. Again, a kind of environment that called forth for engagement from its viewers. There were a series of words hung on little hooks words recorded on an LP. It's actually Kaprow's voice on this recording. This is his student, Lucas Samaras. And then words written on the inside of this space. You could also add words to that space. The words are punctual words, they're cartoony words, they're advertising kinds of words, exciting kinds of words. It's a project that deals with language itself as this peculiar building material for the commercial environment, but also as a kind of poetic material that can be built up in a radically concrete way. Which tells you, again, here's an artist who's working with physical labor of this type, this very primary moving of stuff around. You might think about Martin Kippenberger in relation to this project, or John Armlater has a kind of rethinking of this project as well. And then thinking about language itself and the ways in which language gets used. This is, again, 1962. What's happening in the United States is the slow development of something called language poetry. So there's a speaking relationship between the visual arts, the poetic arts, and the way, and writing, right? Writing itself. Also from that same era, 1962, another example that gives yet another way of thinking about Kaprow's project and another kind of experiment. All of these projects for him are experiments. This was a piece called Courtyard. It is a happening. It's built in the courtyard of a hotel of a very large tower, and covered it again with tar paper, again a toxic material, just so you know. So black tar paper with these white scrolls coming down it at a certain point, and it's a completely sexist piece. On top of this mound, there's a woman lying, and at a certain point in the piece, another thing comes down from the sky onto this woman, and these white bits of spray come out. In this, so it's, you know, it's really obvious that it has to do with sex, and in the most banal heterosexist way, be that as it may. The interesting thing about this piece is that the script for it calls not just for the girl who's up there out of the frame and some suitors who sort of float around at the top, but also calls for photographers. So in among these people, and in fact the person taking the picture, are participants who are scripted as photographers. Meant to take pictures. And I'll come back to that in a second. The piece has a very basic language. It's ritualistic, though it's not a ritual per se. And that kind of basic language is a type of language that increasingly he explores as he pares away the excess, the kind of Baroque details of his earlier work. I'm showing you a still from a work called Household. And here's Kaprow telling the people who are in this piece how it's going to be arranged. Household is a piece from 1964 that was performed at Cornell University in upstate New York. In a piece of open space. And the performance involves separating men and women. Men have certain kinds of activities. They build tall things together, and they make certain kinds of sounds and pound their chests. And the women build little nests together. The men come and destroy the nests. The women make certain sounds and tear their hair. And then at a certain point, an old car is rolled into the space. The women spread it with jam. People lick the jam, and then the men destroy the car. Okay? So it's very highly gendered. Again, it's set up in this binary. There's a binary system. Very simple collective activities that involve simple tasks, the execution of simple tasks. And here he is explaining the shape of this piece. Right? So if you hold that in your mind, people licking jam off this VW Beetle. Here's the structure, right? Long, you can't see it, but it's LMS, long, medium, short. These are the movements of the piece, which is roughly symmetrical in its movement over time. Ignore it. Roughly symmetrical and very clearly marked out, which tells you again there's something about structure that's very important, and there's also something about color, paint. That's important. The color of the jam, the color of the car, this sort of natural space. There are elements that are primary, that derive from a painterly practice, but have been extended now into time and space, and this new kind of material. Another spread from his book, in which now you can see he says he's recalling the act of art, right? That has something to do with labor, and then something to do with immersion. This is actually Claes Oldenburg. It's not Jackson Pollock. It's Claes Oldenburg in his studio space, building stuff. That type of painterly language, so I'm calling that part of his syntax, right? Painterly language. That kind of painterly language extends even into what is probably his most spectacularized project, a happening that took place over 3 days called Gas, out on the beach. And it was it had great funding, which usually doesn't happen in the US, but it had the collaboration of a television news producer to do this thing on 4th of July weekend, which is a big national holiday, very nationalistic. And the culmination, so part of that piece involved a parade down, I think this is Southampton actually, parade down the Main Street, rolling oil barrels, and bouncing these balloons, the circles, black and white, right? It's working with some color thematic, and then the grand finale was spraying white foam down into the ocean. So having foam, white foam from these trucks meet white and blue of ocean water. And here's Kaprow, and I'm not sure if that's Alan D'Arcangelo, but it's Kaprow, Moses coming out of the foam. This was a huge production. It was very simple. It was a parade. There firemen were involved. You got police commissions. There were television cameras. There was a television production made from the work. Important critics and collectors were interviewed about the piece and about the importance of happenings. It was like the Jeff Koons moment for this artist. And it was also the last moment, really, in which Kaprow flirted with having this kind of media recording of his work, because part of what the television recording required was that if the camera person had failed to record the moment when this woman rolled her barrel, they would say, oh, wait, could you go back and do that again? Redo the rolling. Which in turn produced a kind of self-consciousness on the part of the participants. And that self-consciousness is exactly the opposite of what Kaprow was looking for. You'll remember that cage, 4 minutes and 33 seconds, which allows for the opening out of the soundscape onto every possible auditory stimulus, right? Well, if you're suddenly self-conscious, you know, how do I look on the television camera and rolling it right? The way of performing involves thinking about some exteriority, right? Some reflective exteriority, rather than simply going through the actions. So one result of that was the gradual elimination of cameras as observers, the recognition of this kind of self-consciousness, as Kaprow expanded his projects geographically so that they would take place in multiple different places rather than in different parts of one room. They would take place in 3 different cities. I think you have 6 different cities happening, 5, something like that. In multiple cities, at multiple times, in multiple locations. They might not take place at all. He might insert a false press release in the local newspaper so that a happening became an item of gossip, and people thought, you know, well, I missed it. Did you see it? I missed the whole thing. So there was an investment, an engagement, in fact, with the whole process of publicity, of marketing, in fact, of what it means for an artwork, particularly an artwork that isn't an object, but rather is a duration that takes place at a particular site, for that to be a commodity. Oh, okay. These are 2 images, and I can tell you about the photographer too. 2 images from a work from 1966, being assembled around the same time as Gas, the sort of flip side of Gas. A work called Calling that took place on multiple days and in multiple locations around New York City. And the piece involved a variety of different simple actions. Some were in the countryside, some were in the city. One major section involved the wrapping of people, like this. The wrapping up of people and their depositing in different locations. In this case, at the information kiosk at Grand Central Station, the main train station in New York City. So there's a kind of guerrilla insertion of this living mummy in public space. Or the wrapping leaving inside this private space that's publicly visible in the automobile. I like this. Does anybody know who this is? You don't get a fail for 1960s art. So this is Jean-Claude Christo's Jean-Claude Javachin, La Femme de Christo, being wrapped, right? So it's a little teeny joke. Yeah. There are little jokes in there. Calling had, of course, a score, a very simple score that appeared as many of the, and I think you have it out here also, is these sort of typed, in this typed format. That score then was regenerated into a multiple that appears in, this is an imaging of that multiple. It's actually several sheets of mylar on top of a wooden substrate, 25 signed and numbered copies, blah, blah. John Cage had one. You can move these different sheets in different ways so that you get different ranges of these words, pieces of language that bubble up and sink back down. This was produced by Dick Higgins and Alison Knowles, two Fluxus artists, in collaboration with Kaprow. So he's thinking about the parts of these happenings still as transferable into different kinds of projects. And one idea for this project was to not make the Mylar book, but to make a book of cardboard sheets that would be about 3 inches square and about a meter high. Right? So he's thinking about the materiality of the language itself also as an object. And then finally, to think about, in a sense, what I'm calling syntax, Kaprow's language. In 1967, he had his first serious retrospective in Pasadena, California, where I just came from. And it's hot there, of course, and very sunny. And for that retrospective, he generated what I think is one of the best of his works, this piece Fluids, which involved the construction of a number of these very simple, almost carceral, jail-like architectural structures out of 100-pound blocks of ice. So this is very heavy. Blocks of ice in different places around town. And the building of these objects, of course, involves an enormous amount of brute strength, just force, labor, again, work. Art is work, and that work is hard. It has a definitive outcome, that is, you build the structure and then the structure reaches an endpoint or it collapses, as you'll see in some of the documentation. But you reach an endpoint and then it melts, it disappears, it evaporates. So you don't have a product at the end. This is Kaprow, again, thinking about different kinds of physical states, solid, liquid, heat, cold, transparency, opacity, kind of transparent architecture, and what he called a throwaway architecture, right? Again, a type of obsolescence, throwaway architecture.
5 minutes.
Okay, perfect.
Because do you have time to?
Yeah. So I'm nearly at the end, which is good. So I'm going to walk you up to, we will get to here, and then back to here. To think a little bit more about a piece like Fluids, what takes place in that work is, that project is, of course, the labor of moving these ice blocks, the building of this thing, and then incidentally, what do you do when you're engaged in that project with other people? You talk, you have conversations. Whether they're very simple, like, you know, ooh, this weighs a lot, or they're more complicated, you're thinking about minimalism, perhaps, sculpture, art as work. What is work as work? What kind of labor is it to build, right? Conversation. And that transactional, conversational element is built into the project and yet unscored, right? Left open, but very important, as this will tell you. This is a still. There are 2 more things I want to show you. A still from a video project that was commissioned by one of the. There were 3 experimental television stations funded by the Rockefeller Foundation in the late 1960s in the U.S. And the station in Boston, the stations in Boston and New York were 2 of them. For this project, Do you have the videotape of this? I don't. You don't. Yeah. It's actually very boring to look at, and most people, when they watch it today, are like, you know, so what? For this project, there were a number of remote cameras set up in different places around Boston. And those cameras fed back live into the TV station, and then fed back also out to other locations. And people were given instructions at those remote locations. When you see somebody on a monitor, say hello. And if you know them especially, say hello, right? And the cameras were continually switching from one location to another location to another location. Kaprow's in the control room, so I think that's over there, yeah. In the control room. And what he says about this, this piece, in fact, this view of the interior of a television production studio in 1969 is very rare. You didn't get access to it, right? Television, when it was invented, was a two-way medium, right? It was like the telephone. And in order to make it commercially useful, developers, and to make advertising work on it essentially, developers shut off that two-way capacity and rendered it one-way, right? A one-way medium. So it delivers to you rather than allowing you to communicate to someone else. So it's not a medium, it's a delivery mechanism. This returns it to medium status, right? And what Kaprow says he's trying to do here is to show both that it can be a communicative device. In other words, the important part is not this material. The important part is the conversation that takes place. And then the second thing he does with this piece is every time somebody sees someone they recognize and starts to say hello, he switches the camera so they have to talk to somebody they don't know. Right? It's a social engineering device and a very early intervention into what we might think of as the social network. Which brings us finally through all of those kinds of experiments to the very pared down form that forms the bulk of the kinds of experiments that you're doing here. This type of format, which is absolutely about social exchange. This piece is called Rates of Exchange, 1975. What you're looking at is, of course, Kaprow, and I'm not sure who that is, if it's Juan or not, but one of his girlfriends. And they are demonstrating one way in which you might go through this sequence of instructions in which A and B do perform a set of very basic activities. Usually they're kind of intimate, simple. In this case, you take off some of your clothing, you put it back on, you put on the other person's clothing, then they do the same thing. And some kind of recording of that activity in a sort of pseudoscientific way. What's being engaged here, and these are all followed, you do the exercise, and then you follow by reporting on your experience, right? What's being engaged is a kind of attention to the minutiae of the everyday and the minutiae of social exchange, which is what, in the end, this image is about, right? A kind of reflective engagement between artist, an audience, let's say, or beholder. This is actually a postcard, the person holding the postcard and the person pictured in the postcard.